People do not think critically enough. I mean, critical thinking is a skill in short supply, where people take too many things they assume too many things to be true without sufficient basis in that belief. It's very important that people closely analyze what is supposed to be true and try to build up. Try to say, let's analyze things from first principles, not by analogy or not by convention. If you assume things are true by convention, which is actually what most people do, then it's difficult to gain insight into how things can be bettered. So, in any argument or any sort of train of thinking, you want to make sure that the underlying premises are valid and applicable, and then in reaching a conclusion, that the conclusion you're reaching is necessarily driven by the underlying premises and the interconnection between those premises. That may seem like a really simple thing to say, but most people don't do that. So it's really the foundation of rational thought.
And then I think it's also important to reason from first principles rather than by analogy. So the normal way that we conduct our lives is we reason by analogy. We're doing this because it's like something else that was done, or it's like what other people are doing.
Me too type ideas.
Yeah, slight iterations on a theme, and it's kind of mentally easier to reason by analogy rather than from first principles. But by first principles is kind of a physics way of looking at the world, and what that really means is you kind of boil things down to the most fundamental truths and say, okay, what are we sure is true, or as sure as possible is true, and then reason up from there. That takes a lot more mental energy.
Give me an example of that. Like, what's one thing that you've done that on that you feel has worked for you?
Sure. So somebody could say, in fact people do, that battery packs are really expensive, and that's just the way they'll always be, because that's the way they've been. You're like, well, no, that's pretty dumb, because if you applied that reasoning to anything new, then you wouldn't be able to ever get to that new thing.
Right.
It's like you can't say, horses. Nobody wants a car because horses are great and we're used to them and they can eat grass and there's lots of grass all over the place, and there's no gasoline that people can buy, so people are never going to get cars.
Right.
People did say that. And for batteries, they would say, it's going to cost. Historically, it's cost $600 per kilowatt hour, and so it's not going to be much better than that in the future. And you say, no, okay, well, what are the batteries made of? So first principles would be to say, okay, what are the material constituents of the batteries? What is the spot market value of the material constituents? So you can say, okay, it's got cobalt, nickel, aluminum, carbon, and some polymers for separation, and a steel can. So break that down on a material basis and say, okay, what if we bought that in the London Metal Exchange, what would each of those things cost? Like, oh, geez, it's like $80 per kilowatt hour. So clearly, you just need to think of clever ways to take those materials and combine them into the shape of a battery cell, and you can have batteries that are much, much cheaper than anyone realized.
Don't just follow the trend. So you may have heard me say that it's good to think in terms of the physics approach of first principles, which is, rather than reasoning by analogy, you boil things down to the most fundamental truths you can imagine, and you reason up from there. And this is a good way to figure out if something really makes sense, or if it's just what everybody else is doing. It's hard to think that way. You can't think that way about everything. It takes a lot of effort. But if you're trying to do something new, it's the best way to think. And that framework was developed by physicists to figure out counterintuitive things like quantum mechanics. So it's really a powerful method.